What's up, everybody, and welcome back to TarHeelIllustrated.com, or, of course, if you are watching on our YouTube channel, that's Tar Heel Illustrated. I'm THI staff writer Jacob Turner. You guys know who he is, our very own publisher. Andrew Jones joining me, as he always does, for another episode of the THI podcast. This is a little bit different of a show. For those people who've been, seeing some of the off-season content we've been doing a little bit more of these kind of shorter snippet pods on specific aspects of the program. AJ and David have done a couple as well. Brandon and AJ have done one, and me and AJ did a few last week. So I'm going to be continuing to kind of roll these out over the next couple of weeks. And AJ, we're focusing on the positives from last season because, my Lord, is it just full of negativity everywhere when it comes to Carolina basketball. And trust me, I get it. It's not a surprise. And when you look at where Carolina started to where they finished, of course, there's going to be a lot of negativity floating through the air. And obviously, social media doesn't make it any better. So we're going to be focused on a little more positives here. I've got a few that I'll rattle off here in a few minutes, but I want to ask you, AJ, what are kind of the biggest positives for you that stand out? And did you have to sit there and kind of think about it, or were these a little bit easier to kind of come to head than you might have thought of when you look at how Carolina's season went down?
Well, one of the reasons we're doing this is because it's a change. There's so much negativity, and this wasn't a completely negative season. There are positive things that can come out of it and that occurred during the season, and that can be learned from the season. And that's kind of where I'm going to go with some of this, because I'm a big fan of intel. And the more intel you get, the better off you are. You know it needs to be tweaked. Intel, not just because of what works, but also what doesn't work. And I believe that this is going to be a very important offseason for Hubert Davis. I don't know what his circle, who is in his circle, how big his circle is, the people that he reaches out to for critique. We did a podcast on our football show this week about having the analysts come in, these highly successful analysts that have coached Hall of Famers in the NFL, and one of their roles is to critique, is to coach the staff. And basketball is kind of a different bird. It doesn't really have that element to it, but I do think that Hubert needs that, and it's an opportunity for him to learn a lot. Because a year ago, they made the run, and it was a little more difficult for people to spend much time thinking about what needs fixing. But they had 4 months in the regular season that wasn't great. So a lot still needed fixing. Now, because there was no run, they didn't make a tournament. It's all negativity. All people want to think about is what needs fixing. But there is a lot that needs to be fixed. So I think for Hubert, who just finished his second year as a head coach, and hadn't really thought too much about being a major college head coach prior to getting the job, this is a wonderful opportunity for him to have everything that went right and went wrong processed and sort of laid out like a buffet in front of him. And he gets to sample everything and kind of know a little bit more about himself as a coach. So I think that that's a positive right there. There were a lot of individual things we could hit on. Some players that had really good years, that Armando's accomplishment with the rebound record. I thought Leaky achieved some of his goals about being more offensive minded and showing the league he could score. It was there. The percentages were down a little bit, but the aggressiveness was up, and I think that's what he really wanted to show. The fact that he had periods where he could go off, I thought was really, really good. And I think Leaky positioned himself where he's going to get an invite. He'll be in Vegas, and he has a chance to make a roster. And I think that he personally got enough out of his fifth year coming back that it gives him an opportunity to extend his career at the highest level next year. And if he doesn't do it there, he can do it elsewhere. I think that Leaky has a chance. Some people may not agree, but I think Leaky has a chance to make that happen for himself. And I thought RJ was really good.
Yeah, that was my big positive. That's what I was in my head right now. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But it's interesting. I'm grinding out numbers in our tidbit series, which, by the way, we've run I think 5 by the time this podcast runs. There will be about 20 by the time I'm finished. I am absolutely tunneling to the center of the earth on the basketball season and digging stuff up. And one of the things I found interesting was that Carolina was just above 500, but RJ had big scoring games. And what it told me was that RJ knew that there were times when he had to take it on his shoulders and try to score because Caleb was off. Whatever was going on with Armando, Pete and Leakey were wildly inconsistent and couldn't be counted on for significant production ever. So there were some games where RJ, while running the point, took it upon himself. And he made it happen. And they were mostly close losses, so he put him in position to win those games. But I thought it was interesting that, I think there's a leadership component to him. I think whatever leader he's going to be next year as a senior, I think some of that was being fostered in the games that they lost this year when RJ was just saying, screw it, I'm going to have to do a lot of this. So I think that's actually a positive because it's a building block. It didn't render them positive results this year, but I think it could pay off next year. And I look for him to have a huge season. There are other things. I don't want to go long-winded on this. I certainly want to hear yours. And this is one of the most organic podcasts we've ever done, by the way. So I can feed off of what you say right now.
Yeah, and my number one was RJ because I think, like you said, towards the end of the year, I think his game improved, and I think he showed when Carolina's backs were against the wall in some really high pressure must win moments. Even going back to the UVA game, I know they didn't win the game, but he was a guy who just always seemed to step up it was like Carolina was calling out for somebody just to take over, and it seemed like he was the guy, and it didn't really seem like those shoes were too big to him to fill. It felt like he was comfortable doing that. And he looked really good in those. So I think that speaks to, you hit on leadership. And I'll tie this in as kind of a positive, not only from last season, but leading into next year. We did a podcast on RJ and Armando. It's, as of right now, kind of our understanding that we expect both of those guys to return to the program next year. To me, that's a major positive for next year's team because you're bringing back experience. You're bringing back guys that are not only experienced, but really good. I mean, look at the records that Armando broke this year. I know he's been around the program for 4 years, but those are records, surpassing a guy like Tyler Hansbrough, who was there for 4 years. And Armando did more than he did in those 4 years when it comes to that stat, not overall. But I'm saying you're bringing guys back that have been big-time contributors to the program, big-time leaders for the program, and guys that are, I know it hasn't been, sunshine and rainbows throughout their whole careers in Carolina, but been there, done that, guys that when you look at next year's roster and how that might shake out, not only bringing in 2 freshmen, but looking at who's Carolina is going to bring in the transfer portal, I can't stress enough how important it is to have guys that understand the culture, how much it means to play for North Carolina and what it's like to be here and the pressures that come along with it. Because you might bring in a guy from, the Ivy League or from this league that is a really good basketball player, but it's a completely different animal when it comes to handling everything else that comes along with being a North Carolina basketball player. And if you don't have a guy like Armando, you don't have a guy like RJ, and you're coming into a program full of freshmen and guys that have only been at the program, a year or two, haven't really done much, then I think it becomes that much harder to kind of find your role and fit in and figure out how you can shine. So for me, that's kind of not only a positive from last year with, just having those guys on the team, because who knows what Carolina's season, in my opinion, would have shook out like if they didn't have Armando and RJ last year. It would have been even worse. But just the fact that those guys are going to more than likely be back at the program next year is a big and I'll say this too. A lot of people, I think most people are excited about the potential of them likely returning, but I also have seen people that don't want them to return. And for me, that's ridiculous when you look at what Carolina's roster could shake out like next year, AJ, because
stupid is what
can you imagine if they left too, then you've got to not only replace them, but everybody else you're bringing in, you don't really have anybody you can look at. I mean, who are you looking at? Puff Johnson is your most experienced kind of guy over there. And to me, that's not really the situation you want to find yourself in. No disrespect to him, but these are more of seasoned guys, proven, been there, done that guys, all ACC caliber players, heck, all-American player in Armando Bacot, 3rd team. So those are my kind of 2 biggest positives stick out in my head, not only looking to next year as well.
Well, going back to what you were saying about RJ, what you were talking about is care factor. He's got a high care factor.
He cares, yeah.
I'm not saying the other ones didn't, because everybody, body language and stuff like that doesn't always reveal the truth. Facial expressions don't always reveal the truth about people. And I know that some people have made straight up determinations about certain guys based on some of those characteristics. RJ, though, he's got a high care factor. He plays so hard. He's a pinball in there, getting bounced around all over the place, and he gets up and keeps plugging away. And if it wasn't for the finger injuries that twice led him to have tape on his fingers, he would have had a monster season.
I think so too.
If his hand is healthy, and I haven't done the numbers yet, I'm going to do it eventually. There's a lot to break down, but I would believe that his shooting percentage from the perimeter when he didn't have tape on the fingers was above 40%, maybe well above 40%, maybe 44, 45%. When he had the tape on the fingers, it was below 30. So he had a really good year. And he had a really good year in difficult circumstances because I think the weight that Hubert talked about late in the year, I think we saw it on the other guys. Going back to some of the expressions, I think some of those expressions were the weight, it didn't reflect care factor. And I think it affected everybody. But RJ was the one guy that, to me, kept plugging away. Mm-hmm. He was positive, but he was honest. Talking to him after some of the games that they lost, even some of the wins, like the win at Florida State, for example. I remember standing outside the locker room talking to him, and he totally got it. Yeah, we hit a lot of threes tonight and won, but man, we didn't score a third basket inside the arc until 3 minutes into the second half. He was uber aware of all kinds of stuff and how they were playing, that sometimes a made basket can mask a bad possession. He was in tune with the possession, the quality of the possession. So I think that you're right. I think you make a great point. The off season for portal guys coming in and for freshmen coming in with RJ around all the time, I think it's going to be huge. I think RJ could be the leader of the team next year. I think Armando tried at times this year. I think there were so many factors that went into play that it was kind of hard for leadership to really, surface with this club. And part of it needs to be Hubert as well. Head coaches in basketball need to be leaders. There's no doubt about it. And I thought that there was some of that missing as well. So I also think Armando, I'm going to go to Armando here. If you go back and look at before everybody started doubling Armando, and again, read our tidbits on the site because I'm outlining periods of when things started to dip and why they started to dip. And it's traced back to when RJ and Leaky told me after the first Duke game that everybody knows what we're running and they're snuffing it out. And then they go into freelance and they struggled playing off of each other. David and I hit on that on a recent podcast as well. And Armando, that's when Armando started getting doubled. And he was getting doubled in a variety of ways. The double would be there as soon as he caught the ball. The double sometimes would wait until he started to make a move. Everybody doubled him differently, but the one constant was that he was doubled. And sometimes a third guard would be dropped down because some guys you didn't have to defend as much, but also to predictability of the sets and the lack of movement in the sets made it easier for teams to do that. But before he was doubled a lot, go look at his stats in December and after the Virginia Tech game, which he didn't play, through January, he was National Player of the Year stuff. He was locked for ACC Player of the Year. That spin move, that drop step move, the drive from like the left baseline at about 12 feet, that stuff was there. So he showed a lot of improvement in his game, but I think his body took a beating over time. And he did say after the Virginia game in Greensboro that someone asked him, "What are you going to work on this offseason?" He says, "I just need to get healthy." So I think he was really banged up. I think he was highly frustrated, and that showed in some of his play. But he showed a lot of stuff. Now what he needs to do with that baseline drive from about 12 to 15 feet out, now he needs to hit the jumper from there. He needs to show it and shoot it quickly. And if he can add that, then it's going to make the drives more successful. And so I think a lot of that was learned. I think that his game took a big step forward. It's just that we didn't see it the last 5 weeks of the season because opponents squashed everything about him. His last 20-point game was the NC State game when he broke the rebound record.
Yeah.
And that was January 21st. So I think the positives with him are that we saw a lot of stuff. But now the approach and the other guys that are on the floor have to play a role in allowing Armando to be Armando. Because if his fingers are fine and teams cannot afford to double on Armando a lot, you're talking about two fantastic college basketball players. And I think that would have made a considerable difference in the team's record this year. They would have been playing last weekend.
No, yeah, you're absolutely right. I got two more for AJ. These are my final two. I'm gonna throw Jalen Washington in there. I know this when people are like Jalen Washington, didn't really see him a lot, but for me, I think we saw glimpses, particularly that UVA game and some other instances. I knew his playing time was limited, but you got to understand, guys, this is a guy that wasn't even healthy to start the season. He had to kind of work his way back to getting to that point because he missed so much time in high school as well with the injury he had. So for me, we talked about it during the season. I think he's a positive going into next year because I think in a way he could fill a role that they need. I think he's a guy that, AJ, I know we didn't see him a ton this year, but when we did see him, I remember sitting with you on press row a couple of times and being like, man, he looks comfortable shooting that outside shot. It looks good. The form's pretty. He looks comfortable out there. He looks comfortable dribbling out there. And, you know, there's a couple of times where he looked like he might take a nice little mid-range jumper in the glimpses we saw him. And instead he kind of goes into trying to back the guy down. So I think when you look at the potential that he has, I think he's a guy Carolina fans should be really excited about going into next season because I think he could potentially fill a vacancy that they need down there, but I think he's just a really skilled big. And again, you got a guy like Armando coming back. What a great guy to kind of learn from. I know their games are different in some ways, but what a great guy. You're talking about Armando's post moves. What a great guy for 2 seasons to be able to study, practice with, play against in practice, and learn how to use some of those post moves down low. Because again, I think his outside game is night and day better than Armando Bacot's ever will be already, in my opinion. But I think there's still steps that he can take. And again, staying healthy this offseason. Imagine him with a full offseason, fully healthy in the weight room.
Go with it. Yeah.
That to me is such a positive. Last one I'll add, AJ. This is you're talking about a glass half full take right here. But Carolina's, AJ, season's over. You can't go back in time. You can't take a time machine back to you can't go back in time and fix it. Can't go back and play some of those games and score a few extra points so Carolina makes a tournament and makes a run and wins a national championship game. Can't do that anymore. It is what it is. For me, the way last season ended, if Carolina can turn it into a positive. I mean, AJ, think about this, right? Think about everybody on that roster that's coming back. Think about the chip on their shoulder that they're going to have. Think about the motivation they're going to have to come back next year and right the wrongs of last year and say, look, everybody was dogging us all last year. We got dogged all offseason, didn't make the NCAA tournament, declined the NIT. Carolina fans are hating on us. National media doesn't want anything to do with us. Everybody's just kind of forgot about this is North Carolina, and we still have good players in this program. We're going to bring in good players in this program. To me, if this Carolina team can turn last year into a positive, and again, Hubert Davis as well. You talk about a guy in Hubert Davis that is probably learned of a lot of what not to do last year going into next year. He had the high of his first year. He makes the tournament. He's the man. Everybody loves him. We'll talk about this in another podcast we're doing a little bit more depth. And then he has the lows of this year. You're talking about highs and lows of this year of, okay, you know, I got to fix some stuff. So if he can look in the mirror, look at himself and say, all right, I think you talked about this earlier. What do I need to do? What do I need to change? What do I need to fix so that this never happens again? I think that's a big positive that he can take into next year and chip on his shoulder as well. I think Hubert's a big chip on his shoulder guy. I really do. I think he's motivated by that. He talks about all the time about how, you know, I wasn't recruited out of high school. Nobody expected me to have a 10-year career. I did in the NBA, all that kind of stuff. I think he's a guy who really prides himself on beating the odds and proving people wrong. So I think if you're going to look at what's already happened this year, Carolina can turn that into a positive, but it's something they have to do. It's not just going to happen. It's a negative snowball right now. You got to stop that snowball from getting any bigger. And I think Carolina can do that player-wise and coaching-wise if they approach next year in the right way and learn from what didn't work this year and try to fix that going into next year. So, again, that's my glass half full take of how Carolina can turn a really negative season into a potentially a really positive year next year and a really positive step for the program where they say Hubert says, we're not going to let that happen again. I've learned what not to do. We're going to do everything in our power so that never happens again. And what a better way to learn than actually going through it for a year and having to sit there and suffer it. So those are my last two kind of positives from last year, Jalen Washington and turning next year into a positive. I think those are things Carolina can do.
Yeah, I think they're both really interesting points, and I agree in a lot of ways. Let me hit on the Hubert part first, and remind me to hit on Jalen when I'm done with this. I like the chip on the shoulder thing. I see it, but how does that translate to being a coach?
It's a good point,
and I think that's why this offseason is huge for him, because I think one of the from my vantage point, and I can only base this on what I see and sitting 10 feet away from him in a press conference, both after games and our midweek or our Friday afternoon presser and that kind of thing, is often he'll say stuff. I don't know how a guy could step on the out of bounds line and not know the line is, because I never did that when I played. He uses lots of examples about, well, when I played, I didn't let a guy do this. And I think he's having a tough time, or it's just taking time. When I say it's tough time, that would be a criticism. I just think it's taking time for him to understand that each one of those guys on his roster are not wired like he was. So he has to coach them accordingly. He has a chip, but do they have a chip? And if he wants them to have a chip, how does he incorporate that within? And I think sometimes that's very difficult. That's one of the reasons why successful athletes don't often make great coaches, because they have a hard time understanding why the guys on their roster aren't going about it the way they did. And the reality is, what made Roy Williams a phenomenal coach was he knew how to, there were 17 players on the roster. He knew there were 17 buttons to push.
Different personalities.
And I'll tell you, that 2016 near championship and the 2017 title, Roy figuring out how to push Kennedy Meeks' button was what got them to that point.
Yeah.
Because I think he struggled with Kennedy more than a lot of other players. And Kennedy was open about that. And there was a period where he was unhappy. And Roy kind of figured it out, because maybe Kennedy wasn't really receptive to some of the criticism. And then Roy figured out a way, here's how I have to deliver it to him. I think Hubert's still in that process. So to make this a positive, I think that has to be one of the primary reflections that Hubert will have on this season. And if he does have a circle where people will give him an honest evaluation of everything he did as a head coach, that has to be part of the discussion as well. So if he can shed that skin, if you will, of expecting the guys to be like him and then learning how to push their buttons, recognizing that each one of them has a different skin in that sense, then he has a chance to be much more successful. Also, they're going to have to make some scheme tweaks.
Yeah, they have to.
Changing defenses. When you watch the NCAA tournament, you see teams defend, the way they get out there and defend and don't let teams run their stuff. Carolina needs to be better at that. He needs to run more motion freelance. When I say freelance, it's not helter-skelter. It's a motion offense. It's guys learning how to play off of one another.
Yeah. That's
the kind of stuff that needs to be incorporated next year as well. But I agree with you about that stuff about Hubert. I think he's going to learn a lot. Smart guy. He's totally intent on winning there. If he can figure these things out moving forward and they have a good year and it works with Hubert at the helm, I think Carolina's in great shape, because that's the kind of person you want running your program, provided that he can get the wins. And that's something that still is kind of a question mark, if he's going to be able to win at the level UNC should win. As far as Jalen Washington goes, I love your point. I think it's a great point. The fact that he gets an off season, he gets a full off season, having had enough of a taste of the college game that he knows he's hitting that weight room because he knows that was a tremendous weakness.
Yeah.
He was not a guy that banged well. Other teams, when their bigs got the ball, they just turned and scored over him. There wasn't much resistance there. And when I asked Hubert at one of the ACC conference calls, I guess it was maybe mid-February, I asked him, I said, what does Jalen Washington need to do to get on the court more? And Hubert isn't going to publicly dog one of his kids. And Roy a lot of times would say, well, Knucklehead did this and Knucklehead did that. And that was Roy's style. Hubert's style isn't to do things that way. I think he keeps a lot more stuff in-house. But he did let out Jalen needs to get stronger. So I think he needs to get stronger. With that, he'll get more confident because he can play through contact. Right now, offensively, he'll shoot the 12-footer. He won't make the move in the paint because I don't think he feels like he's strong enough yet to make a lot of those moves. So that's what this offseason's about. He knows, look, he went off. He had 12 points and a half against Virginia, against that defense. All right? So that's good. I got to give him some confidence. Now he needs to get stronger, needs to apply what he learned. I think the fear of the injury reoccurring is probably not a thing anymore. So that's all positive. So, and they also got to figure out what they want to do with him. David believes he's a 5. he's more of a modern 5 that can play out away from the paint. Carolina might think he's a 4. So that's going to be part of his offseason as well. Can he be enough of a threat as a 4 to complement Armando? We'll see what they do with the portal, what they think they might be able to get out of him, because if they think he could be a 30-minute-a-game 4, then maybe they don't go for a traditional 4 in the portal. So we can learn a lot about what Carolina thinks about him by who they communicate with here in the next few weeks.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I'm sure there's some other positives we could focus on as well, but for me, those are my biggest ones that kind of stand out. And it wasn't as easy as it would have been last year, kind of going into this year. You know what I mean? These are some things I had to kind of sit here and think about, but I think there are positives. And again, I talked about it earlier. It's so negative right now, and I get it. I totally understand it, and there's a lot of question marks, and there's a lot of things that need to change and be improved, which is why people are concerned. But I also think there's a lot of positives to take if the offseason goes how we expect it to do. And if some of these guys can continue to develop, and Hubert being number one, continue to develop as a coach, as a leader, as a guy who's trying to lead, a group of 18 to 22, 23-year-old men, it's not easy, man. There's a lot of learning curves. And I'll say this too, AJ, it's a whole lot harder job at North Carolina than any other, man. It's one thing to go be a good coach.
That's what I wanted to add.
But it's really hard to be a really good coach at North Carolina just because the standards it's just night and day, man. There's no comparison.
Okay, here's a crazy take, and I'm sure people think, what the hell has AJ been sipping on today? But I think a positive is that you're the third team out from getting in the tournament. You win 20 games, all right? And people are acting as if it's the 8-20 season, in which I covered 22 of those 28 games in 2002. This wasn't that.
No,
now,
really
I think it could be more disappointing than that because of where this team started. I was talking with a fellow scribe after the football press conference on Tuesday about basketball, and he said, how would people view this season if they started out last year number 15 in the preseason poll?
I was talking to somebody about that recently.
Would they be as angry? And I said, they wouldn't be, because that's been sort of the narrative. That's been like, if you're going to write a 4-paragraph story about this year's team, let's say the Wikipedia entry for the 2023 Tar Heels, first thing's going to be they started number 1, became the first team to not make the tournament. That's what it's going to be. So yeah, crazy take is, hey, they won 20 games. They were the third team out, and people are acting as if it's the worst season in the history of the sport. And so that's kind of a good thing, because it tells you what North Carolina basketball is. And it has a standard, but that's also why the evaluation of Hubert, his self-evaluation and the circle that he goes to get honest input is so vitally important. Because Carolina basketball can't be that again. It can't. And quite frankly, in his first year, the first 4 months, it can't be that either. At 1 month. So I guess that's a positive if you think about it.
No, I was actually talking to, I don't know who. I was talking to somebody about the same thing recently. I'm like, if Carolina started out number 22 in the preseason rankings, I mean, people would be mad they didn't make the tournament, but there wouldn't be as much of a panic mode kind of factor because of how last season went down. But again, like I said, and like you said, there's a different standard. 98% of coaches in the country wouldn't be able to make it at North Carolina. That's just a fact, man. It takes a different kind of coach, a different kind of breed, a different understanding of the program and what the expectations are that a lot of people. So there's no shame if you can't do it. Most people can't. But again, Hubert has seen this past year. This is what doesn't work. These are some things that I need to tweak. So if that self-evaluation is there, AJ, he will be fine at North Carolina. But that's a big if, because until it happens, and until we get to next year, we're not really going to know. It's like anything, AJ. There's aspects that every player in the country can improve on, and there's aspects that every coach in the country can improve on in the offseason. If Carolina can focus in on those things, get better at those things, then I think you'll see this program start to go back in the right direction. But it's big ifs, but there is a lot of positives. Maybe not a ton of positives, but there are positives from last season that I think Carolina fans need to remember as well.
And very quickly, some of these positives could carry into next year, like you were alluding to earlier about RJ. So that's kind of that's my exclamation point on this. I think there are a lot more negatives, obviously, but there are some positives. So we decided, hey, let's do a positive podcast.
Yeah. Who knows? AJ might look back at this podcast in a year and be like, man, that was a lot of these things came to fruition. We might look back at this podcast in a year and said, well, that didn't go.
They're still positives. Yeah. Well, I mean, but we're not really projecting positives so much as
what could be.
You got to
positive.
Election season, you got to read the tea leaves. You see these clowns on TV that say that all the time. So I'm going to steal that brutal phrase and say, well, we're reading the tea leaves. These things could fuel into next year, but it wasn't a completely lost season.
No, a lot of negatives from last season for sure. But again, there are positives to take and positives going into next year for sure. So hope you guys enjoyed this podcast. Again, we'll be doing a few more kind of shorter podcasts like this. We're going to be doing one soon about kind of what a difference a year makes, kind of looking back at where Carolina was this time last year to where they are now, just kind of going in depth on that. So make sure you guys keep it locked. AJ and David did a podcast recently. Go check that one out. Me and AJ have done a bunch, and I think Brandon and AJ did one a few weeks ago as well. So if you want to see all those other podcasts, just check them out on our YouTube channel, Tar Heel Illustrated. Just click below and you'll find those under the THI podcast playlist. I've been Jacob Turner. He's been Andrew Jones. We appreciate y'all watching. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, hit that notification bell as well. See you on the next one. Thanks.